Can we get started?
Yes, good morning. Good morning, Aditya. Good morning to all the delegates present over here. Aditya, can you share with your window for your video?
Sure.
Okay. Yes, good morning, Aditya. Nice to see you on an
Yeah, good
online
morning.
platform. It's indeed a great pleasure to invite the alumni of this institution to deliver a lecture on an online 5-day online Atal FDP program organized by your institution. So I welcome you for this program, and I hand over the mic to Harish sir for introducing the speaker for today's session.
Thank you. Thank you.
Once again, good morning, you sir, Aditya sir. It
Hi,
is
good morning.
my pleasure to introduce you for this particular second session of this fourth day's FTP program. Presently, Aditya Murthy sir is working as a uh, uh, in Dr. Reddy's laboratories, Hyderabad, leading a team working on risk management in all drug product entering the clinical bioequivalence studies, new dosage form development using in vitro and in silico tools like GastroPlus, in vitro in vivo correlation, and physiological based biopharmaceutics modeling, and also provide technical inputs on biopharmaceutics aspects to drug product development teams from ideation to the clinical study stages. If you see his educational background, sir has completed his graduation from KLE College of Pharmacy, Hubballi in 2006, and he has completed the post-graduation from Government College of Pharmacy, Bangalore in 2008. After that, sir has worked as a formulation scientist in Apotex Research Private Limited, Bangalore in 2009 to 10. After that, sir has moved to complete his PhD in BITS Pilani, Hyderabad, in from 2010 to 14. After that, sir has worked as a postdoctoral fellow, trainee, and scientist in Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, Hyderabad. After that, sir has moved to uh, Biocon Bristol Myers Squibb R&D Center in 2015 to 19. He worked as a senior research investigator, biopharmaceutics groups. After that, sir has moved to the uh, Strides Pharma Science Limited, Bangalore, as a group leader for formulation and development. In that, sir has worked in the areas of liquid orals as well as lipid based drug delivery system, and he has also handled external projects as well as co-development in that particular industry. In his sir has in his credits around 15 publications in peer-reviewed journals with a high impact factor, and sir has 2 patents in his credits. And uh, Aditya sir has presented the various his findings in national as well as international uh, uh, summits, such as some of them, such as in Canada, sir has presented his findings, as well as in USA also he has presented in Singapore, particularly Nano Today conferences like that. Sir has also presented his various findings in the national and international conferences. Sir has given a invited talk in uh, various institutes. With this brief introduction, I once again welcome you, sir, for this FDP program, and hand over to you for this session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Thanks, ma'am. Thanks, Hari sir, for your kind introduction. Just confirm.
screen is visible. You're audible.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for having me here in this session. So today I'll talk on in vitro and in silico tools in drug product development. So as said during the introduction, I'm currently working as a lead in biopharmaceutics department at Dr. Reddy's Laboratories. So a disclaimer as a part of the standard protocol. The disclaimer is that whatever content is being presented that does not represent any any of the understanding from the company. This is purely all the material that is presented is taken from the literature, and the company is not kind of responsible for any of the contents that are presented herein. Thanks. So just an overview of what we are going to talk on today. I'll start with the introduction. We'll talk on what is biopharmaceutics. We will touch on what is biopharmaceutical risk assessment, because this is something that is catching up in the industry, especially in the last assessment, both in the NCE domain as well as in the drug product development space in the generic industry. So we will talk on that part. Then we will see how do we do a biopharmaceutic risk assessment for a drug substance, especially when you're working with new chemical entities, API, which does not have, where you do not have a good understanding about the properties of the API. So what kind of risk assessment is done and what tools are used. Then we'll talk about biopharmaceutical risk assessment tools for drug product per se, which will be talk is more focused on the formulation and evaluation, biopharmaceutics risk evaluation for the formulation. So we will again dive deep into what is some of the in vitro tools and in silico tools, and then in the end I'll cover a few slides on the regulatory aspects in terms of how we can use some of these in silico tools in terms of coming up either with a generic equivalent formulation or a better formulation. Uh, some of the aspects that I would like to cover would be deconvolution, in vitro in vivo correlation, population simulation, virtual B. I know this spans a big area, and I may not be able to do justice individually for each and every topic, because each of these topics can actually be taken up as a presentation in itself. However, I'll try as much as possible to at least give you a flavor of the things that currently are being practiced in the industry, and also what to expect going forward in next few years in this domain. So let's get started. So biopharmaceutics, what is biopharmaceutics? So when I say biopharmaceutics, what are the words or what are the things when we say biopharmaceutics, we talk about a dosage form, we talk about absorption, we talk about permeability aspects, we talk about solubility, we talk about dissolution, we talk about in vitro in vivo correlation, we talk about liberation from the dosage form. So pharmacokinetics. So there are a lot of words which form a word cloud, which are associated with biopharmaceutics. So by definition, biopharmaceutics examines interrelationship between the physical chemical properties of a drug, that is the API, the dosage form in which it is present, and as well as the route of administration that you are using, and it correlates all this to the PK properties, which essentially would be the rate and extent to which the drug becomes available in the systemic circulation. So all this together essentially comprises of biopharmaceutics. So let us now look at what is biopharmaceutics risk assessment and why it is useful. So here I have a couple of publications from recent times, where from some of the reputed journal. The left one, the one on the left, was published by FDA, and then in this area. So biopharmaceutics risk assessment, this is something where we are now trying to understand. We are moving beyond the realms of simply understanding the process or the formulation variable. We are now trying to correlate everything to how it performs in vivo, and two things we focus on: whether that is providing a safe formulation to the patient, and whether it is efficacious or not. So all these things we are trying to understand and biopharmaceutics risk assessment is essentially based towards that. So also there was a recent webinar series from FDA that talked about setting up the clinically relevant dissolution specifications, and also FDA had given its perspective on biopharmaceutics risk based approach, which we will see in few slides from now. So essentially, on the left side, you have the in vitro dissolution. On the right side, you have the patient. So what biopharmaceutics is essentially a bridge between the in vitro dissolution or in vitro performance and the in vivo performance of the drug. So that is well represented in this particular slide, where you can see that biopharmaceutics is being presented as a bridge that can connect the in vitro to the in vivo. So here's time on the x-axis and the plasma concentration on the y-axis. So as we are, most of us are aware, whenever you administer an oral dosage form, a solid oral dosage form into the GIT, it undergoes disintegration, dissolution, because dissolution is the first step before the drug gets into solution. After which the drug gets permeated into the body. Eventually, it is eliminated. So for a given drug, the rate of elimination is constant. So that doesn't vary unless you really, make some molecular modification to the drug output rate, or essentially in this case, dissolution that can change between different dosage form, and that is heavily dependent on the dosage form, the environment in which the dosage form is present, etc. So that is something which we can use as a control to guarantee the in vivo performance. So here, as you can see, the first graph here represents a formulation that shows rapid dissolution and rapid absorption, and you achieve the Cmax and AUC pretty quick. Then the same formulation with some modification, shows a slightly different in vitro dissolution profile, where it has become a little slower compared to the upper formulation. And with little bit of slowness, what you may not have a significant impact on the physicochemical, on the PK properties of the molecule, because essentially the absorption process or the physiological process is slower than the dissolution. Hence, you don't see much of a change. However, when further change happens and the dissolution drops down even further, you eventually see that you will not be able to match the absorbed release. So this is again a very generic example to demonstrate how the in vitro dissolution may impact the in vivo behavior of a given drug. Although in all the cases the drug is same, just because we are varying the dissolution here, the overall PK properties are varying. So the assumption here is there is no barrier of permeation, so the drug is highly permeable. The only rate controlling factor, rate limiting factor here is the dissolution rate of the drug. So moving on, we talked about the FDA's current view on this area. So earlier, I think most of you are familiar with the design space concept. How we actually identify the critical material attributes, critical process attributes, and the combination. They give you a space where you say that, okay, within this space, wherever I move, my quality of the product is not impacted. So that represents the yellow circle out there. However, now a new concept has come up, which is called the safe space. Safe space is essentially a space where within this space, I mean, when I say space, this is again a hypothetical word that we are using. Essentially, this is a limit or a kind of a range where if I have my dissolution within this range, then my overall performance in vivo condition will not get varied. And how do I achieve this space? I achieve this using appropriate tools like biorelevant dissolution, modeling and simulation tools, and of course, I need the in vivo proof of concept. So I think this forms the very basis of our today's discussion, where we will look at the in vitro tools, the in silico tools, and the in vivo tools that help us in establishing this kind of safe space where the performance, in vivo performance of my formulation is guaranteed as long as I'm able to maintain the dissolution within the space. So this is very similar to the design space concept, but much smaller. And of course, all these contribute to this safe space. So this is what industry is moving towards, and the FDA also is kind of pushing to establish design space for most of the products, so that the performance is guaranteed. So every time you change your composition, make a small tweak in the formulation, you don't have to again go back and do a bioequivalent study to demonstrate to the agency that this change is not impacting the in vivo performance. Rather, what you can do is you can have a space where you can say that when the dissolution is between this number and this number, there is no impact. So once you establish that space, wherever you're moving within the space, there is no need to do again a specific bioequivalent study to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the product. So with this introduction, moving on, let's look at the biopharmaceutical risk assessment tools that are used for a drug substance. So drug substance essentially means an API which is not yet into the dosage form. So when you look at the NC domain, there are three tools that generally people use to assess the biopharmaceutical risk associated with a new API. One is what is the food effect, how food affects the performance of the new API, what is the and the in vivo performance, and then what is the pH effect, because this is very big problem, especially when you are on a concomitant therapy, especially when you take a lot of pills, and amongst the pills you also have antacids, or the agents that suppress the gastric pH are there. So because of that, what happens is that under in vivo condition, the pH under before and after consumption of a particular antacid would be different. And if your drug is sensitive, especially because of its inherent nature, it is sensitive to the pH in which it is present, then it can give you completely different exposure. So these are three major risks that we would be evaluating in an NCE domain. So let us look at each of these risks in detail. So here's an example of itraconazole, Sporonox, that demonstrate a pH effect, negative pH effect, and a positive food effect. So what it means is the exposure actually goes down with low gastric acidity. So in fasted state and in antacids, you generally have lower exposure. However, in fed state, the exposure goes up. So what is important to note here is that food not only changes your the gastric motility and delays the gastric emptying, the food also changes the pH, local pH. So usually, say, let us consider under fasting stage your pH is 1 to 3. In fed state, the pH goes as high as 4 to 5.8 or 6 also sometimes for in humans. So this could significantly impact a drug that shows sensitivity towards pH. So we will look at other examples. TNIPs, usually all these anti-cancer drugs which end with the name TNIP, lapatinib, nilotinib, dasatinib. So these kind of drugs also show positive food effect, mostly where the AUC and the Cmax actually increases by multiple folds when you consume them with food, and they are strictly instructed to be taken on empty stomach. And then another example here where you see that the absorption increases and it has to be taken with food. So food effect can be positive or it can be negative, and it can be beneficial or not beneficial, but then depends on what kind of product we are working with. But ideally, for ideal product, you don't want to have food effect, because you don't want to put those riders to the patient saying that you have to consume this only after food or before food. So not having food effect is something that is desirable and ideal. Stomach will impact the physiology. So when you use delayed, and then secretion, bile salts, the ionic composition, gastric transit time, and motility, the blood flow is impacted. Eventually, all this impacts your dissolution, solubilization, and then there is also a chance of precipitation, which in fact impacts your in vivo performance. So how do you actually study the food effect? So you can use in vitro tools or the in vivo tools. Typically, a dog model is as a preclinical species is usually used for studying the food effect. So again, under in vitro, you could look at the API properties. What can I alter in the API properties to overcome this, or can I do something with the formulation? So lipid-based formulations, I think, as most of you would be already aware, lipid-based formulations play an important role here because they actually simulate the fed state, right? So even if you're taking that content in a fasting state, because you have solubilized the drug in a lipid matrix and then you're kind of giving it, so it actually simulates a fed state even though you're consuming that in the fasting state. So that can be one of the approaches that can be studied. And then of course you have the biorelevant media, the fasted state. simulated intestinal fluid, fed state simulated intestinal fluids, and then fasted state simulated gastric fluid, etc., which can actually give you a good understanding what would be the food effect when this product is taken under in vivo condition. So here's an example where we have seen, here the dotted line represents the fasted state and the solid line, the fed state. So you can see that a positive food effect with the solid line, that is the, the exposure, both the Cmax and the AUC have gone up. Negative food effect, the black curve, the solid dotted line indicating that there is a negative food effect. But this is all very qualitative. How do you quantify this? So we'll come to that. How do you quantify the food effect in the subsequent slides? Now let's look at what is pH effect. Okay, so we said there are three main arms or three main pillars that we study. One is the pH effect, the food effect, and the particle size effect. So we covered food effect. Now let's look at what is pH effect. So, when you have a formulated drug product, it undergoes disintegration, it is dispersed, and then it undergoes dissolution. So after dissolution, based on the pH it is present, it can either continue remaining in a dissolved state or it can precipitate. And, the solubilized drug can also undergo degradation. Some of it gets permeated, eventually gets absorbed into the body. So here you have on the scale here, this is a log scale. So essentially what it is showing is that when you have a salt form of a drug, we will come to how the salt form of a drug is helpful in maintaining a certain concentration in the dissolved state. So what we see is at the lower pH condition, the salt form of the drug ensures the drug has, higher solubility. So the red line here indicates the target concentration that you need to dissolve. This is a typical stomach scenario under fasting state. So when either you consume antacid or food, the stomach pH gets elevated and goes to 5 or 6. You see there is a sharp drop in the solubility, and it also goes below the target concentration where it starts dipping, and eventually that gets, the salt gets disproportionated to a free base. It gets converted to a free base, and the solubility condition, because the dose is not able to be dissolved now, and it is much below the required concentration. So what are the causes of elevated gastric pH? As I said, pH modifying agents like antacids, your prazoles or antacids can actually have this impact. Achlorhydria, disease conditions. What is the impact? Again, your dissolution, your solubility, your supersaturation, and your precipitation all get impacted because of the pH effect. Okay. Moving on to the particle size effect. Again, this is pretty well studied and understood. So here we have an example of a same drug which was tried as a nanocrystal, a jet milled material, and a hammer milled material. So clearly there is a significant difference in the particle size distribution across all these three different approaches. And as you can see, the exposures in a dog. So this was actually done in beagle dogs, and what we can see is that clearly there is a difference. As the particle size decreases, the surface area increases, your overall solubility increases, and then your in the exposures also increase. And as the particle size gets increased, the exposures decrease. So now the question remains, what should be the ideal particle size? So I think we will come to that as well. We will look at how do you measure the pH, food, and particle size impact. So like I said, you could quantitatively measure this. So the pH effect is considered to be either high, medium, or low. This is what we mean by risk assessment, where there is a problem, but then eventually you want to understand whether the problem is low, or it is a medium level problem, or is it a problem that is pretty high. So we want to bucket the risk into either high, medium, or low. And for this, what we do is usually you take the ratio of AUCs depending on what is driving the efficacy, whether it is the Cmax that drives the efficacy or the AUC that drives the efficacy of the product. You take the ratio of untreated to untreated, means this is where no antacid was given, and this is where the same medicine was given along with the antacid, and then you check the ratio of AUC or the ratio of Cmax. And then if the ratio is 1, obviously there is no impact. If the ratio is less than 0.2, then it is considered to be a high impact. 0.2 to 0.5 is considered to be a medium impact, and above 0.5 is considered to be low impact. Now for food effect, you take the ratio of AUC fasted to fed, and then again, anything below above 1.5 is considered to be positive food effect. Uh, 0.8 to 1.5 is considered to be no food effect, and then below 0.8 it is negative food effect. Okay, and then when I say high food effect, FDA very clearly gives what should be the calories in the meal. Typically, this is 1,000-calorie meal with 50% fat content, and then you have other options like standard meal and light meal as well with defined calories and fat content. And moving to the particle size effect, again here it's the ratio of AUC milled to unmilled, and below 0.5 we considered that is to be high, 0.5 to 0.8 as moderate particle size impact. So now that we have seen different strategy or different risks, let us look at how can we mitigate some of these risks in the product. So we can do that either by modifying the drug substance itself, or by making an enabled formulation, or by modifying the drug product. So the drug substance modification essentially involves preparation of salts, co-crystals, amorphous forms. And for drug product, you can have again in the NCE space, one of the most preferred options is spray dry dispersion, because it is scalable and reproducible. And then other enabled formulations, as I mentioned, lipid based formulations, nano milled formulations, etc., can also be evaluated. So let's look at how these work under in vivo conditions. So let us say you have a free form of the drug that shows solubility and pH effect. So you want to convert that free form into a salt form. Like say I want to make, depending on what is the counter ion, whether I have a basic drug or an acidic drug, so I can choose either a hydrochloride salt or whatever, a phosphate or sulfate. So I want to make a salt form of this drug, and although this salt form carries a disproportionation and recrystallization risk, still it has some benefits. The other alternate option, as I mentioned, is I could also make a spray dried dispersion of the drug, which is a formulation intervention that can be brought in. Let's see how these three work under in vivo conditions. So you have time on x-axis and drug concentration on the y-axis. So the light blue line here represents the the free form of the drug, or the base form, that shows that dotted line is the minimum concentration that is required for efficacy, and the base product, the base form of the drug, is hardly dissolved and hardly absorbed. So it is kind of just about meeting the requirement. Now what happens when you make a salt? When you make a salt form of the drug, what we get is typically we define this as a spring effect. So the spring effect is nothing but the increase in the kinetic solubility of the drug. So this is temporary, but this gives a sudden boost in the solubility. And as long as the pH conditions remain, and there is no transit, it can maintain this kind of supersaturated state for some period of time. But eventually, the moment there is slight change in the pH, as it happens when the formulation or the drug moves from one compartment of GIT to the other, there is a rapid change in the solubility behavior, and then the salt crashes out, or it almost becomes free base, and the supersaturated levels fall down rapidly. So this we call as a spring effect, because this is like a spring which is compressed. When you compress the spring and leave it, there is a sudden jump that you see, which we call a spring effect. Now this is what happens with salt, but with a spray dry dispersion, where you have molecularly dispersed your API, and it is in contact with a polymer, and it is stabilized by a polymer matrix, then what happens is, yes, you have the spring effect similar to salt, but because you have a polymer now that prevents the rapid crashing of the drug in the in vivo condition, you have a much smoother and much slower curve that comes down very slowly, and then you have overall the AUC, if you see, is much improved with this. So it comes like a parachute, the way if you jump from the sky with a parachute, very slowly you'll be landing here. So on a similar lines, the SDD actually gives the kinetic solubility advantage, but it will maintain the supersaturation for a longer period of time in vivo, which causes this parachute effect. So salt we can imagine as a spring effect, and SDD we can imagine as a spring plus parachute effect. So obviously any day SDD would be better, but it comes with its own challenges in terms of stability. So this is something that's not commercially preferred, but during the initial stages with the NCEs, people do attempt to make either the salt or the SDD. Okay, so what is the risk and what is the issue and how do you mitigate? So here we have a drug with poor solubility of crystalline base. So what is the issue? The issue is that you cannot get exposure escalation. So when you're doing this initial studies with the NC, you want to actually test it at different doses and check whether there is a linearity in the PK parameter. So this will not be achieved, especially with with a compound that has poor solubility. And another compound which has a pH dependent solubility, again you have exposures at high elevated gastric pH would be a problem. So converting that to a salt or a STD might be more useful. Okay, so I think, yeah, I mean, we will take the questions at the end, but I hope you're following till this point. If you have some quick question, I can take it, or we can move on. Okay, so I'm assuming there are no questions. Thank you. So moving on to the biopharmaceutical risk assessment tools with respect to drug product development. So now we have seen for the NCs or the drug substance. Now let us see, what are the kind of biopharmaceutical risks that are associated with drug product and how do you address them? So again, we can bucket the tools that we use for biopharmaceutical risk assessment for the drug product into three buckets. One is called the in vitro bucket, the in silico bucket, and the in vivo bucket. So in the following slides, I'll be talking more on the in vitro and the in silico tools that are used in drug product development. So under the in vitro, we have the pH solubility study and the dissolution study, and under in silico, we have simulations using softwares like GastroPlus. We will touch more on this in the coming slides. Okay, so let's look at some of the in vitro tools that are commonly used in this kind of biopharmaceutical risk assessment. So here on my slide, I have equipment called Pion microdissolution advanced USP apparatus like 4, etc. that can be used, but I'm not touching on those because they are pretty common and everyone is aware of that. So what we are trying to focus here are some unusual tools or less known tools that are used to assess the risk. To make things simple, we can just imagine this as a miniature version of the USP2 vessel, except that you don't have a paddle. You have a stirring element in the bottom here, and you don't have to withdraw the samples. You have a probe that can actually be dipped in, and it can take live readings, like without actually sampling. You can keep on taking readings at every 5-second intervals, where you can collect say, for example, the dose is 100 mg and you want to put that in 250 mg. Whatever the concentration you get, that concentration you put in this case in this vessel, which is made of glass, and then you have your biorelevant media. Again, this is useful in the NCs also, where you're playing with small amount of material. The same probe can also be fitted into a conventional USP2 vessel also, and then you actually look at this works based on the UV fiber optic principle, and as the solution passes through this small window here, you'll be able to quickly take the reading. So this solution would have been calibrated, or rather the probe would have been calibrated before the experiment, so you can actually get the time versus concentration from this. And this is pretty useful when you are actually you want to study the the food effect, or when you want to check the pH effect. You want to see how long that supersaturation is maintained. You have multiple formulations of spray dry dispersion. You want to check, like, between formulation X, Y, and Z, which formulation will give you the maximum benefit. So for those kind of things. And then there is form transformation issues in NCs. When you are actually running the experiment, you will see that in the middle of the experiment there is a precipitation, and as it recrystallizes, the API appears in a different form, different polymorphic form, which will have different solubility and distribution properties. So in all, so how do we do it? Here's an example of how do we study pH effect. So you have a gastric compartment with pH 2 that is there. You put the clinical dose per 250 ml here. Then you again add further the FASIF, which is a biorelevant media on this, similar to what happens in GIT. So imagine this is your stomach compartment. It stays in stomach for 20 minutes under fasting condition, 15 to 20 minutes. Then it goes to your duodenum. Essentially, it will meet this kind of environment. and you make sure that after dilution the bile salts, that's the reason you have put as 1.5x, because this is getting diluted with SGF. So when this gets diluted, you make sure that overall concentration of bile salts will remain similar to what is expected. And then you run the experiment for 3 hours, and then you keep taking the samples, keep taking the measurements, and then check how the transition happened under the in vivo condition. And then for food effect, you have like fasted media, pH 6.5 media, which is there as an intestinal compartment. So from there you have the fed media, which is again taken in a separate compartment. And then what you can do is check the overall area. Like say, for example, if you get a curve, you check the area from this and area from this, and then take the ratio, and you'll use the formula that I showed in the previous slide to see if the food effect is positive or not there, right? And here here's an example how this is actually from the experiment with the here, which shows that kinetic solubility advantage I talked about. So each dot analyzed. So you see that the purple curve kind of goes up, and then after 20 minutes, once you dilute it, right? So once you dilute this, the pH changes, and then there is a rapid crash. Again, it starts redissolving, and it maintains that. So why the concentration is low here? Because you have diluted, right? So the concentration is dependent on the volume, and because the volume increased, your concentration goes down here. It's not normalized for the concentration per se, but this maintains this level for a certain period of time. Solubility falls, right? This is the point where the conversion is happening. So you can estimate from this that under in vivo how long this will be able to maintain that kind of super saturated state, and how long the exposures can come up with this. And here a green curve is for a base where you have same drug as a base, where you initially there is some solubility, and upon dilution it goes down but never picks up. So this clearly shows how we can use this tool to measure the advantage or to measure the impact of salt on the API. The next tool I'll talk about is Disoflux. So again, this is a commercially available tool. Essentially, what we do is it's typically a USP dissolution apparatus, but with permeation clubbed into that. So you have a smaller chamber here, which can hold your biorelevant media, and then you have a membrane here. So I'll talk about what membrane we use. So you have a membrane here, and you put your dosage, another stirring element inside the smaller chamber, and this goes on top of the main vessel. And once you put your dosage form here, the drug dissolves, and as the drug dissolves, it slowly permeates across this membrane and then enters here. And this happens till there is an equilibrium attained, and you keep sampling from both the chambers, from the outside and the inside chamber, to determine how quickly. So you can use this especially to study the impact of excipients like surfactants, wetting agents. You want to see how they are going to help you in the in vivo permeation. So this can ordering. You have 10 formulations, you want to screen and bring it down to 3, then this tool is pretty useful. And it's basically you measure the flux also using this formula, because the surface area of this, the thickness, the surface area, and the time it takes. So you can actually measure the flux. So as I mentioned, this is useful for rank ordering formulation, comparing different absorption of potential formulation, understand the excipient effects like surfactants or permeation enhancers. You want to again compare, and some of this data can also actually go into the in silico modeling, which we will be talking about in next slide. So this data can also be a useful input for the in silico modeling approaches. Okay, so people may say, we do have Keku2 for that. Why do you actually want to do? Yes, Keku2 is available and it is much better. However, you have some disadvantages with Keku2. One is that it is a cell monolayer. Here it's a lipid activated synthetic membrane. Keku2, some of the active and passive permeability processes are mimicked. Here it's purely passive. There is no transporter that you can study in this case in the Disoflux. But you cannot check the finished dosage form on the Keku2. You cannot put a tablet on the Keku2 layer, right? So you have to dissolve that and then spike that in microgram or picogram concentrations to actually study the permeability in Keku2. So this is something that's not possible studying a dosage form. Here you can study the actual dosage form, and you cannot actually predict the food effect and other things. With the Disoflux you can, and this requires culture and a lot of maintenance. This is easy and fast, and the cost is high. Here the cost is low. So as a tool, mostly in the drug product development, we cover a lot of Disoflux. So this is the membrane I was talking about. Again, briefly, this is a cellulose membrane. Either side you have cellulose, and in between you have a lipid bilayer, which is sandwich. So it looks like transparent, but that goes on to this holder that I mentioned here, and then the drug starts permeating across. Because this is a lipid bilayer, it kind of simulates the absorption from the intestine. Okay, now again changing gears. Are we good till now? How are we doing on time? I think yeah, I have like 15 more minutes.
You have 15-20 minutes more, Aditya.
Okay, great.
And session is going on very well, no issues.
So in silico tools are some of these softwares that we generally use for assessing the biopharmaceutical risk with respect to the dosage form, and also for the drug substance. So some of the tools that are commonly used in industry is GastroPlus, which is very commonly used tool, and it's a very nice tool that can give you very accurate predictions on the in vivo performance. You have Simcyp from Certara, but this is more from a clinical from a clinical standpoint. So this does not give you much of the formulation related information you can't input in this tool. However, here you can actually study different types of formulations as well, IR, DR, SR, whatever, mix multiple dose where you want to have like one layer of IR followed by ER. So all that can be studied here. Here, I think this is more for simpler formulation, but it has far more capabilities in terms of data analysis. Then you have Phoenix Vinolin, you have Triple D Plus, where you can actually without actually touching a beaker, you could theoretically come up with a combination, a formulation composition. And then if you have some data and some understanding initially, you could actually build a model, and you can theoretically start varying the concentration of excipients in your formulation and then come up with theoretical dissolution profiles. So how does that help? It can help in reducing the number of experiments. So instead of trying 20 different variation or 40 different variations of a given polymer, I know which are the variations that can give me meaningful differences in dissolution, and I can only focus on those formulations. So this tool again helps in that case. And you have Pumas, which is again a software that's recently been developed by some of the ex FDA colleagues. And then you have PKSim, which is a free software that is available. So my discussion would mostly focus on GastroPlus, because that is what we use day in day out. And so I'll talk more on GastroPlus in this session. So again, the big picture. So what is exactly a mathematical model? Say any process, whether it is a physical process or a chemical process, you could actually kind of represent that in a mathematical equation form. And that mathematical equation can be converted into graphs and charts. Very simple example would be like, y is equal to mx plus c, which is a straight line equation. Similarly, you have equations for quadratic function, cubic function that can give you three-dimensional pictures, etc. So on similar lines here, the idea is that we take in different parameters and then we come up with a mathematical equation, and that mathematical equation kind of tells you what is the relation between each parameter and a particular PK parameter in vivo. Like say I want to study what is the impact of change in polymer on my Cmax, right? So then I need some connection there, some bridge, which is provided by a mathematical equation, which we can develop using softwares like GastroPlus. And once you have that correlation developed, what you can do is now you can try different values of polymer and then get different values of Cmax, because you have Y, you have X, and you have something that connects the Y and the X, and then that kind of helps me in doing a lot of assessment. So that's the whole idea here for all the software tools, that you want to connect or correlate what you see in vitro to in vivo, and then you want a bridge that kind of takes you from in vitro to in vivo, and that helps you in understanding. Because in vivo experiments are expensive, so I cannot probably dose 20 different formulation and study the impact in vivo, and that's not ethically correct also. So what I do is I take my best formulation forward for in vivo dosing after doing all this background work in the software. So this kind of virtually simulates the actual study that you will be doing under in vivo conditions. So how does it do it? So you have the structure. So you have a tool called ADMET Predictor. So essentially it is like, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, prediction tool, where you can actually basically put the structure of the compound, and some of the, based on the structure, it calculates a lot of properties like effective, the permeability, the solubility information is something you have to give it. It does give theoretical solubility, but at times that is not correct. You may have to have the solubility information. LogP, it can calculate pKa and fraction unbound and all that it can calculate, and this can actually go into the model. And what you can also do is, with your in vitro experiments, enhance or enrich this initial understanding, which can go into model. Then you have the formulation factors like dosage form, the particle size, release profile, dissolution profile, etc., that can be put in. And then with that you can actually build a base model that can basically, it can give you an absorption model or a PK model, that is a baseline absorption model. And then with this understanding, once you have the model, you can use that model to understand the regional absorption, where in the GIT your dosage form is getting absorbed. So I'll come to this in the subsequent slides. You can use it to deconvolute. Deconvolution is a process where you have an in vivo profile. From that, you want to kind of understand what is the relation between the fraction absorbed and the time. Okay, which indirectly indicates the in vivo dissolution, because you are doing in vitro dissolution, but you don't know how the dissolution happens under in vivo conditions. So deconvolution kind of gives you that handle. And then identifying the in vitro release for new testing, and will it be successful, all these kind of things. Then you can also do it for in vitro in vivo correlations, which is part of QBD, and then even virtual bioequivalence, where you can have like the test formulation and reference formulation. You can have a group of people which you can select from Caucasians or Indians, or whatever. Indians are not there, Caucasians, Americans, etc. You can have the Japanese population with certain characteristics, and you also can enter what is the variability you have noticed based on your understanding about the molecule. What is the inter-subject variability that you have seen from your study. All that can go into the model, and then virtually you can actually run a bioequivalence on 50 subjects or 100 subjects, and then get the confidence before going to the actual study under in vivo conditions. So this is about GastroPlus. So let's look at very simply, in a very generic way, how to build a model. So you give input parameters like permeability, pK, log-P, pH solubility, pHD, particle density, dissolution data, time for precipitation. This is pretty useful, especially if you are working with compounds where you already have studied how much time it is going to be stable under a particular pH condition. Then dose and dosage form, and then you also have to give some IV and oral solution data for the disposition parameters. Primarily, you want to have the clearance, the KEL, and those kind of things that you can actually get from your PK understanding, and then you can input that. And the species physiology, like you can actually do it for rat, dog, and human. So generally we study in humans, but you can also do it for other species. So this is how a model looks. Typically a simulation time in x-axis and concentration in y-axis. So the boxes here represent the input in vivo data that I've got from literature, right? So either a oral solution or IV data that I have put in here. It's a oral solution data, which is represented by box, and the solid line is the simulated parameter, which was simulated, or this relation was developed by taking into consideration all these things: pK, log-P, pH, pHD, all that was taken into consideration, and this was developed. So you can see that is pretty closely fitting. So now I have a model that kind of replicates the in vivo performance. So I can now alter anything I want and check how this gets impacted. The solid line gets impacted in my model. So this is what is called a base model. And then as I was saying, you can also look at the absorption region information. So again, I think this is a little small. I'm sorry for that. But the first compartment here is stomach, then duodenum, jejunum 1, 2, ileum 1, 2, 3, cecum, ascending colon, and then the total amount absorbed. So this is like the actual bioavailability. So you can see that for some drug that we have tried here, you can see that in the duodenum, jejunum, the maximum absorption happens, and then this correlates with your Tmax also, because Tmax is where you reach the Cmax, and then this kind of correlates with your Tmax as well. So this is pretty useful when you're designing a dosage form. So we do a lot of study where we are developing this differentiated products, new products where I want to convert a formulation which is currently as an immediate release to an extended release formulation. So how do I know, where is the region of absorption? Like, should I have a gastro-retentive system, or should I have a simple matrix-based control release system, or a simple, delayed release system? So this kind of gives me that understanding. Okay, mainly the absorption is happening from upper GIT. So if I have a gastro-retentive system, probably it is better because this is the region where it absorbs. So if I have something where it's showing a particular window and I make a system that is delayed release, then here the drug release happens also, there is no absorption because absorption window is actually in the early part. So this kind of helps in also building a good understanding about what kind of dosage form design we have to have. So we use this again frequently for that purpose as well. So applications of GastroPlus for predicting in vivo performance. So here's again an example where you can see, again the time on x-axis and the plasma concentration on the y-axis. So the red curve here, is for a free base that we talked about, the pH effect that we were talking about. So free base that is demonstrated by the red curve, which shows low exposure under elevated gastric condition, right? So essentially what happens is when I give this under normal condition, you have a green curve which is showing adequate exposure, but upon change in pH because of either antacids or food, the exposure comes down. So what I do, I make a salt form of it, and then I study that, okay, there is a improved exposure despite the pH change. So how in this case, all the boxes that you see are the real data points, and the solid line that you see is for the predicted curve. So this is exactly same as what I explained here. The boxes are actually the real data and the solid line is the simulated data. So you can see that our simulated data in all the case is pretty close to the actual observed data. So how this is useful? The boxes were obtained after the study, and which is something done later. But before going to the study, we had already had this solid curves based on simulation. So we knew that for a given condition, how the base is going to behave and how the salt is going to behave under in vivo condition. And that gave us confidence that salt will perform under in vivo condition. For salt form will perform better under in vivo condition. Hence, we went ahead. You could also have multiple different salts and then select the one that gives you the best performance and then take it to the in vivo. So this is kind of correlating the in vitro with the in vivo performance. Another application is particle size selection. Often we have seen that particle size effect is a significant problem, and the particle size has impact on the dissolution. So but how, if you have a drug that shows pH dependent solubility, there could be multiple approach using surfactant, particle size reduction, etc. So most preferred approach is reducing particle size. But the question is, what should be the ideal size of the drug substance to ensure in vivo performance? So there is something called a parameter sensitivity analysis. So this, I think, who are familiar with QBD and design expert, they would know that we kind of study multiple factors, and we come up with these 3D graphs that help us understand what is the zone where we will get the results that we are looking for, and what conditions we have to use to obtain that particular result. So very similarly, we have something called a PSA here, where you can see that on one axis you have the pH, another axis you have particle size in microns, and then the Cmax, and here it is for the AUC, same thing, particle size, pH, and then the AUC. So what this is showing is that as my pH gets elevated and the particle size increases, there is a sharp drop in the Cmax, and the blue-green regions represented drop, and this orange region on top is where I am able to get a sufficient Cmax here, and similarly for the AUC. So essentially Cmax and AUC are similarly impacted by pH and particle size. So for particle size above 100 micron, here you see a steep drop, and for pH above 4, you see a steep drop in the AUC and Cmax. So maintaining particle size below 100 micron will ideally be giving me the required exposure in terms of Cmax and AUC. So this is how another way you can use the GastroPlus. So quickly now switching gears, again, these few slides, I'll just talk about what are the other applications. So you can, as I said, you can have a set of population where you can study one formulation, which is your, in this case, the pink formulation is the reference, the green is the test. You want to do a bioequivalent study. You want to see whether your Cmax, AUC are within the 80 to 125% confident at 90% CI, whether it is between 80 to 125% T/R or not, as per the bioequivalence criteria. And you also want to cover the 90% CI. So here the solid line represents the mean data. The pink zone represents the 90% CI for the reference, and green zone represents the 90% CI for the test. So here very clearly based on virtual bioequivalence, where I have done this bioequivalence study. I have input the dissolution data for my test formulation, input the dissolution data for my reference formulation in the software, and I have developed a model. So I have predicted the concentration for my test, predicted the concentration for my reference, and I have overlaid both of them. And here I am demonstrating that my predicted T/R will be within the bioequivalence criteria, and I'll be able to meet the criteria, which gives me confidence to go into the in vivo studies and take this formulation forward. So another application is IV-IVC, where you have time versus percentage release, and then you want to correlate, or you want to convert that into fraction versus time, fraction absorbed versus time. And then these two you will try to correlate, where you have fraction absorbed versus fraction in vitro release. And here you see a good correlation. And again, this correlation can take different forms: linear, power, quadratic, cubic, etc. Or sometimes you may have to do some time shift or scale shifting, which eventually gives you a correlation. So once you have this correlation, later, as I alter my in vitro release, I know how much my in vivo performance will get altered. So this is something that can go into, and there are certain acceptance criteria by FDA that have been mentioned in terms of how much prediction error we should have. And this needs to be validated additionally with more experiments later with more in vivo studies to prove that your model is valid. So yeah, so in summary, basically the in vitro tools help in screening, rank ordering, and assessing the drug substance and drug product. In silico tools help in combining the in vitro data with the physiology and the species that you are studying, and give you the relevant understanding. And then in vivo studies in relevant species will confirm the prediction. So basically you come up with a hypothesis, and then you confirm with the relevant species. So overall, an integrated in vitro, in vivo, in silico approach, either in a prospective or a retrospective manner, can help you in assessing the biopharmaceutical risk associated either with the drug substance or the drug product. And early screening can help in reducing the timelines, reducing the number of experiments, and also designing appropriate dosage forms that will suit the clinical strategy or the TPP. Yeah, so with this I come to the end of my presentation. I would like to acknowledge the help, guidance, and support from my manager, Dr. Tausif Ahmed, his manager, Dr. Siddharth Chanchad, and the entire biopharmaceutics team from Dr. Reddy's. Thanks a lot. We can take few questions now if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. It was indeed a very pleasant, full, and a very exhaustive session. Naturally, we were all these days of training, we were studying about the different emerging trends. But today we have studied how this dosage form, what is being developed, how we can predict the in silico parameters as well as the in vivo parameters for this, so that we can go for an in vivo studies. Now we have a couple of questions, Aditya.
Sure.
There's one question: which of these free version of GastroPlus model is available for demonstration purpose?
So unfortunately, GastroPlus is an expensive software, and the free versions are not available. So as I said, there are other tools like PK, Sim, etc., which are not as capable as GastroPlus, but they have few capabilities, so that can be explored. I think if I go back to the slide where I had all the softwares listed. Yeah, so this I think is freely available. Pumas is relatively less expensive, but again does not have much of flexibility in terms of the inputs that you can give from a formulation standpoint. But none of these tools, Vinolin, I think many are familiar. Phoenix, it's now called Phoenix, so it's not that expensive. But GastroPlus, Triple D Plus, and SIP are a little expensive, and unfortunately, you don't have free versions available for that. I think this also kind of opens up a possibility where if a group of academic academicians can come together and pool some funds and have a common license that will be available, I think it can benefit a lot. So it can be again, commercially used as well, just to, because this license is like every year you have to get it renewed, so you can generate enough revenue to renew this, and it can be something that can be useful for everybody. But that is something which we can think of in future. But as of now, no, unfortunately it's not freely available. But I think for academic institutions, this comes at a very relatively a reasonable price compared to the industry. So I know a few academic institutions where they have actually installed the GastroPlus, and they are using it. One being BITS Pilani Hyderabad campus. So I think you could reach out to people there and kind of plan some collaborations. And if funds can be pulled, I think we could also get more number of licenses and more modules can be added to GastroPlus.
Okay, there's one more question. How will one decide to use either Wagner-Nelson method or a Weibull function to use the deconvolution method? Do you confirm from any preclinical study the method of absorption, or it is just an in silico modeling?
No, so I think Weibull method is more for fitting the data, especially when you are using controlled release dosage forms, and you want to fit it into the Weibull function. That is where we mostly use it. Wagner-Nelson are Lee Riegelman method, Lou Riegelman method, and Wagner-Nelson are more commonly used. But it's not about methods. These methods can give you some understanding, especially if you're using Phoenix. I think you by default you use the Wagner-Nelson or the Lee Riegelman method. But then it's more about what fits from the in silico, what fits your IV/IVC better, and where your regression values are better. Weibull, I think we are not using it for any of the deconvolution purposes, but the other two that I mentioned, we use it. But then again, it all boils down to what fits your data better, and there is no one thumb rule that says that okay, this can give you the best output in terms of the correlation or understanding. And deconvolution, to be honest, it's not very good tool. At times, yes, you can get some understanding, but then it's not the only tool that will help in understanding, because mostly, see, again, there is a difference in deconvolution between what you see in Vinolin versus what you see in GastroPlus. GastroPlus also accounts for physiology, so the deconvolution from GastroPlus is called mechanistic deconvolution, and it is much better as compared to Vinolin that gives you simple numerical deconvolution. That is completely mathematical equation based, and at times it's not very good unless you have a perfect BCS class 1 drug and a perfect controlled release matrix that follows close to a zero order release. Then it can work. Otherwise, it generally, especially for IR and all, it doesn't work that well.
Okay. My question is regarding Disoflux.
Yes, ma'am.
And do this study with using that Permi. You suggested one Permi app, that membrane. Using this membrane, can we design this particular apparatus here itself?
You could do that in theory, but then it takes a lot of effort, and this is not expensive. It comes almost slightly little more at a slightly little more cost than the USP2 apparatus. So at least for the industry, it costs anywhere between 18 to 20 lakhs per equipment for 6 jars or 8 jars. So I think that is something which can be commercially purchased, because I think what Electrolab has done is they have optimized everything, and they have their own small stirrer inside a small sampling cannula, and all the distance from this paddle to this has all been optimized, and they have done multiple trials in this to kind of give you the confidence that this tool is a good tool which can be used for rank ordering and selecting the appropriate formulation, or understanding how excipients influence the behavior of a formulation. So yeah, I mean, I would not recommend, although you can do it, but there are too many variables, and the results will not be reproducible with a custom setup. So because this is already available, we could simply get that from Electrolab and use it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions from the delegates? Yes, Aditya, your session was too good. and we could learn so many things like concept of safe space. This is the first time I heard this word. Now we were just we could just learn from design space and all that, because we are into drug development. This safe space word which I got to know is the safety and efficacy of the formulation within this space and the parameters associated with it, using the in silico as well as in vivo studies. I'm very happy to hear from you that you have been doing so well in the Dr. Reddy's laboratories and doing so many things. And you gave us about the different in silico tools which our students and our faculty members can train themselves. As you told, there is one in silico tool, that is PK scheme, which is available free.
Yeah.
So we can use at least these models and come up with some in silico studies for our molecules, which will be preparing some co-crystals or doing some polymorphic transformation studies at college level. Thank you, Aditya. It was a very good presentation, and all the delegates have been posting that your session was too good, and I'll be even taking a feedback from them. And thank you for joining us. The next, I'll hand over the mic to Harish sir to thank and conclude this session.
Thanks, ma'am. Thank you. I appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your nice presentation on physiology-based biopharmaceutics modeling, particularly in the field of biopharmaceutics. I hope the doubts of the delegates have been cleared by Aditya sir. Sir, thank you very much for your presentation, as well as clarifying the doubts of the delegates. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time. Thanks for listening. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Dear delegates, we will end the meet. The next session, that is afternoon session, will start at that is 2:45 p.m. So kindly join at 2:45 p.m. so that we'll start the session exactly at 3:30. The link for this session for the feedback will be posted at 2:45. Kindly join early to give the feedback for this session. Thank you. Any other issues for the delegates? Delegates are not very meaning interactive during the session. You're not hardly 2 or 4 people. Most probably I'm getting 4 questions. One is Shweta. Shweta ma'am is giving, and Dr. Ramesh sir is very interactive in all the sessions, and other people not much. 1 or 2. Sneha Patil madam also is giving a lot of interactions, but other people, they are asking questions, not the video is on. Little bit apprehensive for all these things. I kindly request that at least make use of these sessions. We have meticulously worked for designing this all these sessions, and collaborating with academia, industry, and conducting this FTP. Kindly I request all the delegates to utilize these speakers and ask your questions, clarify your doubts. So thank you. So we'll be again rejoining at 2:45. So I shall end the meet over here. We'll rejoin the session at 2:45. Kindly be on time so that we'll start the session exactly at 3 p.m. Thank you. Yes. Hello.